distributed, where the numbers are. And you'll see that there's quite a big dense area right here around northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. And it's thought that there's somewhere in the region of 70 or 80,000 animals living in this area, which is a really, really healthy number. Very, very healthy. Up in the Arabian Gulf, so that area right there, that is the second stronghold for dugongs in the world, with an estimated number of somewhere in the region of 8 to 10,000 dugongs. So again, very, very large numbers. As to why it's very, very dark on this side of India is beyond me, because there's practically no dugongs anywhere there, except for in the Gulf of Kutch, which is that little bit right there. And then obviously this southern bit around northern Sri Lanka and the southern tip of India. So there's definitely dugongs around there. But those are numbered in the sort of low hundreds, not in the 80,000 of northern Australia. And so we're talking about a fairly critical population. There are then populations of dugongs over in Madagascar and along the eastern coast of Africa, again, in a couple of places in the hundreds, but in the majority of places, like in Tanzania, probably around 10 or 15, a very, very small number of dugongs. There are dugongs over in Malaysia. I live sort of somewhere on there, but there are dugongs around here, in the tens and in the hundreds, depending on where you are. There's quite a few off Thailand, off this coast of Thailand, so there's quite a few. And interestingly enough, there's a remnant population of dugongs here in Palau. And that is the most isolated population of dugongs in the world, and probably no more than 50 to 80 individuals. And when those disappear, that would be the end of the Palau population. The migrations just are too far for animals to be moving backwards and forwards. How that got settled in the first place is beyond us, but there is a unique and very distinct, genetically distinct population that's based in Palau, and there aren't very, very many of them there. And then there are dugongs down into the western side of the Pacific, in Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, those sort of places. So there's some dugongs left around, but two big hotspots. Ones that are left in the southern part of India and northern Sri Lanka are the ones we want to focus on for the rest of the time. One of the things that is interesting about dugongs is that their range is temperature dependent. So as the water temperatures cool, what happens is the seagrasses don't grow. And when the seagrasses don't grow, there's no food. Thank you very much. There's no food for the dugongs, and so their distribution can be linked very, very closely to water temperatures. Anything below about 20 or 19 degrees Celsius, chances are you won't find dugongs. But what's important about this is as feeding becomes limited, dugong reproduction stops. And that's where it's critical for us to be knowing what the seagrass habitats are like, what condition they're in, and ensuring that we don't have issues like dredging and siltation and chemical runoffs that might impact those seagrass beds and in turn impact dugong breeding. When you want to look at populations of dugongs, when the numbers are very, very small, how do you measure a change in a population that's so small? Very often, you'll run transects from the air, maybe through aerial surveys, and you'll count 10. But if you run those surveys 10 years later and you count 11, is that a big difference? And so a lot of the things we look for is the birthing rate, the calving rate, and trying to see how many individuals are counted giving birth, because that gives us an idea of animals coming into the population. We then know through hunting or bycatch or whatever the number of animals that we're losing to that population. As I mentioned earlier, these animals will maybe grow up to about 70 years. And the way we know that is they grow these tusks, very much like an elephant does, but they don't protrude very much from the body. And these tusks have rings on them, just like the rings of a tree. And the rings on those tusks can give us an idea of age. So you can age a dugong by the tusks, by running a clean cut all the way through it and counting the rings. So you get a very good idea of age. This is the dugong from a male that was removed after it had been salvaged. But this is a dugong feeding on A typical patch of seagrass, notice it's not very big, and they're digging all the way down and getting down into the roots. But this stuff will all grow back fairly quickly. There she is. I think there she is. Yes. All right. So when you look at when we think of dugongs and we think of their replenishment rate and what sort of requirements there are for conservation, because they have this long period to maturation, and because they have this low fecundity and low calving rate, the best models that we have available are telling us that you need to preserve roughly 95% of the population to ensure its survival. Those are huge numbers. If you can think of other species, it's typically nowhere near that. Sea turtles is probably down at the 70% range, and with fish it's down at the 50% range. But with dugongs, it's all the way up there at the 95% range. That means that if you have 100 dugongs in Sri Lanka, you can't afford to lose more than 5 a year. Right? Think of that in terms of bycatch, strandings, direct hunting, all of these things. Chances are you're losing more than 5 a year. And that means your population will be in decline. And in order to reverse that, we need to decrease the rate of mortality so that it at least comes back up and allows the reproduction and the calving rate to replenish the population. Right? So that's how high replenishment rates need to be. Now, how do people study dugongs? And for the most part, you get to see dugongs from the air during aerial surveys. And this is a very expensive undertaking. People are going backwards and forwards, hours and hours in the air. And many dugongs spend a lot of time underwater, so you don't get to count them all. So this becomes a very, very expensive undertaking. Doing boat surveys becomes a very expensive undertaking. So there are aerial surveys, but what we're trying to get up and running here in Sri Lanka in the coming months are very low-cost questionnaire surveys that are linked to spatial data. And those questionnaire surveys come with maps, and fishermen help fill in details on maps. But we can use that data and import it all into GIS systems that help us prioritize conservation areas. So those are the things that are going to be happening in Sri Lanka in the coming months. And aerial surveys are all kinds of fun, but they get to be quite expensive. The other way that surveys are done is by using boats and getting in the water and actually trying to capture them. And trying to capture them is the fun bit. Right? This is where you go home at night and say, I'm never doing that again. And this is a typical little expedition. This was done in Australia a few years back. But typically what would happen is you're on a boat and that, I know that was me when I was a lot thinner. That was me when I needed a weight belt to fall in the water. Now I've got my own weight belt. All right, but so you jump, and somebody says jump, and you just jump. Oh, okay. And you jump, and the idea is to try and grab onto a dugong and see how far it can swim you around the ocean. In my case, it was quite a distance. And but there you are. Eventually, you grab hold of this thing, and it's. When I first did this, the guy that taught me what to do, he says, you just jump in, grab it around the tail, and hold on tight. He never said anything about the fact that they spin like crocodiles. Right? He never said anything about the way they start just really bending over like this until they flip you over. Right over. They never said anything like that. They just, no, it's easy. You just jump and grab onto the thing. So there I was, and as soon as you do this, so like 28 people have to jump in and help you hold onto it. But there we were without Dugong eventually. Isn't it cute? See? Like this nice little baby. But this little thing, I tell you, this was only, well, you can see it's not a huge animal, probably only about 2 meters long, probably not much more than about 300 kilos. The sort of thing we wrangle on a daily basis, all of us, right? Exactly. So this is a very labor-intensive process, and we were doing this because we were putting satellite transmitters on them to see where their migration patterns were. But it gets to be very tedious, gets to be quite tough, and not to mention painful. I think I had bruises from here all the way through to here for about 6 months after. But that's how one catches dugongs. And so with all of that, it's kind of hard not to really like them, isn't it? You can see how the whole mermaid thing came around. This guy actually married this one. They have two children and one calf. But no, it's a very good friend of mine, Scott Whiting. That you can see how they're a very, very endearing animal. So a lot of people wonder, well, why? You know, what's the big deal? It's a dugong, right? Why don't I just go home and have dinner? Why should I be worried about a dugong? And I get asked this question frequently, and it gets linked to turtles and dugongs and all of this. Why should we conserve dugongs? I don't know. They're cute. I don't think that's really going to cut it. Because morally I think it's right. Nah, that's not like I don't know them. Because all of you came tonight and you believe in it. Yeah, try telling that to the rest of the Sri Lanka. The truth is that dugongs have an immense value. You know, all of this cutting of seagrass, as I was saying. How many of you have a green grass lawn at home? At least two of you must, yes. There's 1, 2, 3, okay? 3 of you. But you all understand the concept of when you cut the grass, it looks really pretty and it's nice and smooth and everything. And if you don't cut it, it grows long and eventually goes brown and isn't so healthy. Well, the same happens with seagrass. As it grows long, sunlight doesn't penetrate to the lower layers, and oxygen doesn't really penetrate down to the lower layers, and so it's not very productive and it's not very healthy. And these seagrass habitats that dugongs live in are the same habitats that act as nurseries for juvenile shrimp and juvenile fish. So these habitats that dugongs are helping rejuvenate and helping keep healthy are the same habitats that are providing us with our artisanal and local fisheries. There would be no shrimp and many fish species wouldn't be around if we didn't have healthy seagrass beds. So imagine if we lost dugongs, if we lost sea turtles, what would we eat? And many people don't, you know, it's kind of hard to get your head around the fact that an animal like this is making sure I can have shrimp for dinner. But that's the case. I imagine many of you are vegetarians, but shrimp for dinner doesn't really count. But you get the idea, right? A lot of fishermen would be out of work. So there's one real tangible value for you. That dugongs play this ecological role maintaining seagrass beds that in turn provide fisheries and income to people, to humans, that sort of thing. And the more that message gets out, well, those seagrass beds have an immense value to us in terms of seabed stabilization, in terms of larval growth, grow-out grounds, those sort of things. That's when I think the whole process of conservation is going to pick up a little bit more.